precision delivery of medicine. Entertainment franchise games absolutely exploding. Small modular reactors and the nuclear renaissance, plus AI moving into very complex workflows. Now, these were just a few of the major tech innovations that partners at A16Z predicted last year. And our partners are back, and we just dropped our list of over 40 plus big ideas for 2024, a compilation of critical advancements across all our verticals, from smart energy grids to crime-detecting computer vision, to democratizing miracle drugs like GLP-1s, or even AI moving from black box to clear box. You can find the full list of 40 plus builder-worthy pursuits at a16z.com/bigideas2024, or you can click the link in our description below. But on deck today, you will hear directly from one of our partners as we dive even more deeply into their big idea. What's the why now? What opportunities and what challenges are on the horizon? And how can you get involved? Let's dive in. As a reminder, the content here is for informational purposes only, should not be taken as legal, business, tax, or investment advice, or be used to evaluate any investment or security, and is not directed at any investors or potential investors in any A16Z fund. Please note that A16Z and its affiliates may also maintain investments in the companies discussed in this podcast. For more details, including a link to our investments, please see a16z.com/disclosures.
Hi, my name is Jorge Conde. I'm one of the general partners here at Andreessen Horowitz. I'm on the Bio and Health team where I focus on investments in the life sciences. My big idea for the year is programming medicine's final frontier. Where are the reusable rockets for biotech? Traditional drug development is painstakingly time-consuming, risky, and expensive. It's highly bespoke, too. One molecule has no bearing on the next molecule that gets developed. Like traditional rockets, they're one-time use only. That's changing. SpaceX's rocket reusability has transformed space travel, lowering costs and expanding horizons. Similarly, potentially curative programmable medicines like gene therapy can reuse components like the delivery vehicles used to target specific cells while swapping out the genetic cargo. The next mission uses the same rocket to deliver a different payload to a new destination. The FDA is looking to the skies and taking a page out of the FAA's approach to aviation safety, rigorous yet adaptive, recently launching its own new Office for Therapeutic Products and piloting Operation Warp Speed for rare disease to create more transparent and flexible processes for evaluating and approving programmable medicines. Imagine a future where we redeploy, not reinvent innovation. It will revolutionize how we make medicines and where these medicines can take us.
All right, so Jorge, I feel like this big idea is so compelling. This idea of programming medicine certainly sounds like something that the whole world could benefit from. But before we get into that, maybe you could just break down a little bit further why traditional drug development is, as you say, so painstakingly time-consuming, risky, and expensive, and maybe also just put a number to that. Like, how long does it really take for drugs to be developed in 2023 terms?
Sure. So first of all, the reason why it's so painstaking, it's so time consuming, it's risky and expensive is because we're putting something into human beings. And so, of course, the bar of what we're going to do should be and is exceedingly high. In terms of how long it takes, these are averages of averages, of course, but on average, it could take anywhere between 10 to 15 years to develop a drug, to get it to patients. And that's obviously a very, very long time, especially in diseases where people are desperately in need for better treatments.
So why does it take 10 to 15 years typically?
Well, typically there are three stages in developing a medicine, right? The first one is what we would call, the actual drug discovery stage, which is, the work that goes into, finding a target in a disease that you would like to hit with a medicine. In some cases, that target is already known. In some cases, you're looking to discover new targets to go after to have better treatment options for a given disease. That can take many, many years, even in that first phase. The second phase is what we call preclinical development. So now it's this work of once you have a target you think is worth hitting and you have a molecule that you think hits that target, you have to do all of the work to develop that molecule into a medicine, to ensuring that it has all the qualities of what you want a medicine to have in terms of how it's absorbed and how it's metabolized and where it goes to in the body, and whether or not it's toxic. And if so, how much of it is toxic. All of that work we do in what we call preclinical development outside of humans. We do this in dishes and cells. We can do this in animal models like mice or even monkeys. And that, as you can imagine, also takes many, many years. Yes. And then, of course, there's the third phase, which is the most important phase, which is what we call clinical development, which is the terms that many would be familiar with in terms of human clinical trials, where there's a phase 1 trial, a phase 2 trial, and a phase 3 trial. And that process can take anywhere between 5 to 7 years. And so when you add up all of those phases, the drug discovery phase, the preclinical development phase, the clinical development phase, that's how you get to these 10 to 15 years. And I should add that once you're done with clinical trials, you now have to file for regulatory approval. So here in the US, you file with the FDA. The process by which these applications get reviewed by the FDA, despite the FDA's best efforts, can take 1, sometimes even 2 years to go through. So again, when you sum all of that up, it's you can see why it can often take well over a decade to make a medicine.
Absolutely. And to your point, the bar being high is a very reasonable concept, but where does programmable medicine come into play here? And how does that maybe change the paradigm across each of those stages? Or where does it have the potential to really reshape that arc?
Yeah, so I think this is where the concept of a programmable medicine potentially could be very transformative to how we think about developing drugs. And that is because in a programmable medicine, there are multiple components that could be, as I described, redeployed for different applications. So let me give you an example. A gene therapy is this idea that you can deliver a genetic payload. In other words, you can deliver a gene to a cell that has a defective version of that gene. If we're able to make a medicine that does that can deliver one gene to a given cell type, it becomes increasingly likely that we'll be able to deliver a different gene to a different cell type for a different disease. And that's very different than the way we traditionally make medicines. If you think about a traditional medicine, like a chemical, a molecule, that is a chemical that is tested and designed for a specific disease, a specific target. The second you switch the target, we don't reuse the atoms in the molecule and try to fit them into a new target. We just design a different molecule. And that's why I say, in traditional drug development, one molecule has very little bearing on the next molecule you design. But in the case of these programmable medicines, where all the components can be reused, you just have to essentially redirect or redeploy components like, delivery vehicles for gene therapies, or in the case of a gene editing medicine, just redirect what edit you want the enzyme or the protein to make. And that is where the programmability comes in.
And that sounds huge, right? Just so I understand you correctly, when you're talking about the reusability of these medicines, it's basically the equivalent of the reusable rocket is the almost like the you basically would have already gotten a certain drug approved to be able to deliver something. Each time you're reiterating on that, would you then need to have the specific genetic almost like payload in there reapproved? But most of that legwork has already been done. Am I thinking about that correctly?
That's right. In this analogy, what we would love to see become possible is that, the rocket in this case is the vehicle by which you ensure that your payload is delivered, right? And some of the most common ones that we know in terms of what would be rockets here are the LNP molecules that all of the COVID vaccines that many of us received were delivered in.
Right.
The COVID vaccine was mRNA. mRNA had the instruction for what it wanted your body to make, and that was encapsulated in this LNP particle, lipid nanoparticle. It's like a little ball of fat. Similarly, for a lot of gene therapies, instead of using an LNP particle, we use something called an AAV, which is an adapted virus. It stands for adeno-associated virus. There have been examples in the clinic where payloads have been delivered with LNP or payloads have been delivered with AAV. For different applications, all you're swapping out is the cargo, the instruction of mRNA that's in that LNP, or the instructions or the genetic cargo that's in that AAV. And this is very timely because the FDA is starting to signal that they are looking for ways to be increasingly adaptive to ensure that they can adequately review these therapies that are reusing components, but do so in a way that will be both rigorous, but also adaptive and therefore hopefully more speedy.
And where people don't have to start from scratch because they already have that rocket that is reapplicable. So tell us a little more about that, where the FDA seems to be taking maybe some inspiration, or at least that's what you allude to with the FAI, right? So what can they learn from the rocket reusability in this analogy, and what also may be fundamentally different? And what are you taking from some of the new announcements, like the new Office of Therapeutic Products?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things to take from this. The first one is that I think there's real recognition here that we are seeing meaningful innovation in terms of the kinds of medicines we can make, and the FDA is appropriately trying to find ways to retain their rigor, because again, they have an extraordinarily high obligation to ensure safety and efficacy in patients, but to move hopefully more quickly to attempt to keep up with all the innovation we're seeing. And so they've pushed forward on several fronts that I think are already pointing us in that direction. The first one is they've announced an Office of Therapeutic Products whose mandate and mission is to find ways to do exactly what we've been describing. And so I think the industry, the drug development industry, now has a partner in the FDA in trying to find the best paths forward along the lines of what we talked about. The second is they are also trying to innovate themselves. The FDA is looking to be more nimble and is running experiments to find ways to do exactly that. So, for example, many of us would be familiar with Operation Warp Speed, which was the effort by the government to try to ensure that the COVID vaccines could reach all of us in a very, very timely manner, given the nature of the pandemic. Well, the FDA has said there are so many intractable diseases, many rare genetic diseases that have no good therapeutic or treatment options. So they are launching a pilot program mirroring the concept of Operation Warp Speed, but to apply that to rare diseases, where they are going to run some experiments to see different ways that the agency can interact with industry to get these medicines more quickly to the patients that so desperately need them. And so I think those are very, very promising signs that both the industry and the government are looking for ways to ensure these innovations reach patients in a timely and responsible manner. And there's also other proof points that we can point to that are happening every day right now. So, for example, several companies that are developing cutting-edge gene editing medicines are starting to get approvals by the FDA to move forward with some of their key clinical trials. And there had been a moment in time where the FDA was being more hesitant, but I think as they've started to evaluate these technologies more carefully, they've started to develop a path forward for these medicines to continue to get developed. And the breaking news is that the first CRISPR therapy has been approved. This is a therapy for sickle cell anemia and beta thalassemia that was developed by a biopharmaceutical company called Vertex Pharmaceuticals, working with another company called CRISPR Therapeutics. And this is a therapy for essentially curing a genetic disease, in this case, sickle cell anemia, by taking the relevant cells out of the body, editing them with the CRISPR gene editing technology, and putting them back in the body in a way that results in a functional cure. And this is a big deal for so many reasons. The first one is it's the first time that a CRISPR therapy has been approved as a medicine. Yep. The second reason why this is a big deal is that I think it's an important milestone on this to this point about the future of what programmable medicines could look like. Now that you have a first approval, you've demonstrated that a CRISPR editor could be safely used as a medicine. So now if it edits something differently, the process for getting that approved should hopefully be, shorter and faster. And the third reason I think that this is a big deal in terms of a milestone is relatively speaking, how quickly this has happened. So you asked me at the beginning, how long does it take to make a drug? And I said about 10 to 15 years on average. It's barely been 10 years since the concept of CRISPR was discovered and described in the scientific literature.
Right.
So we went from the initial discovery of CRISPR as a potential use as a medicine all the way to an approval in just over 10 years. That is lightning fast in this world. So it's just an exciting moment in time, I think, for the industry and hopefully for all the various patients that are looking for better solutions and treatments for their disease.
Maybe you could just speak a little more to that. Like, if we are able to see this confluence that you're discussing and this idea of programmable medicine becoming a reality, what does that really mean in terms of like the speed of therapies coming, the number of them, the new business models that might be unlocked, how this might ultimately end up impacting patients? Any just kind of high level thoughts about this, if we are moving to this new paradigm, what that really means?
Yeah, I think it means a couple of things. The first one is I think it means that for the benefit of patients, every time we run a clinical trial with these types of medicines, we're not starting from square zero or from square one, because we already know something about the various components in the therapy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that generally speaking, these programmable medicines are going after diseases where the cause of the disease is very well known. In other words, it's a known mutation, and it's the ability to intervene has been, in an effective way, has been what's been elusive for us. So in a lot of ways, these new programmable medicines are just a fundamentally new superpower. We can go after diseases that we weren't able to go after before. And as a result, the third thing that I think this means for all of us is that we may be on the cusp where, the elusive C word is a reality, that we might actually have cures for lots of very intractable problems. And that is a very new day indeed, right? Like that is something that it just has not been very common in our industry. So I think there's lots of reasons to be excited.
Yeah. I mean, as you're talking, I'm like actually smiling because it's hard. It's impossible not to be excited. But I guess just to close things off, you've painted this beautiful picture of what may be to come. Could you share a little bit more about the blockers, if any, whether regulatory, whether it has to do with the fundamental science that's coming on board? What would you say if this reality that you're painting were to not come to pass? What would those reasons be? And also, maybe for those listening, how can builders get involved? How can they actually help make this reality come true?
Yeah. So first of all, in terms of the blockers, I think there are several, and I think they are important. And some of the blockers should be there. So the first one is everything I'm describing in terms of these programmable medicines has another side of the coin to it, which is these are largely speaking permanent medicines as well. So, if you take a pill and you have a bad, a reaction or adverse event or toxic reaction to that pill, you just stop taking the pill, and eventually your body will clear it. And, hopefully, the toxicity has been addressed. In the case of making a permanent edit in DNA, if there is an error, if there is a toxicity that comes from making that edit, something inadvertent, it's permanent, or at least it has the potential to be permanent. And so for that reason, the FDA appropriately has an extraordinarily high bar for how they think about evaluating the safety of these medicines, and how they think about which diseases are probably the most appropriate to go after with something that is potentially a cure, but also potentially permanent.
Yes.
So that's one blocker that is just going to need to be addressed systematically, and it should be. Mm-hmm. A second blocker is one of the only medicines that work are the ones that get to patients. And these programmable medicines have a couple of challenges in terms of accessibility. The first one is these are not pills you get over the counter. These are very complex medicines. And so therefore, the process by which you get treated can be a very long and difficult process. So I just described the approval of CRISPR therapy for sickle cell anemia.
Yep.
The process by which you get the treatment could take months because you have to get your cells removed, the cells get edited. In this case, you actually have to get a form of therapy to kill your internal cells so you can replace it with the corrected ones afterwards. And that could be a long stay at the hospital. So that whole process could take several months. So the accessibility of these therapies will limit how many people can get them and when. And the second element to accessibility is cost.
Yes.
And today, these therapies can cost on the order of millions of dollars. Now, on the one hand, that millions of dollars of cost is justified because a lot of R&D went into it. They're very expensive to make and manufacture. It's very expensive to manufacture all these components I'm describing. And that's number two. And then number three, they provide a fair amount of benefit. In the case of treating a baby that had, something like somatic muscular atrophy that would have otherwise died, a one and done gene therapy from Novartis. This is a therapy that's its cost about $2.1 million, effectively saves that baby's life. So there's an incredible amount of value that comes from that.
Absolutely.
But the cost of discovering, developing, manufacturing these therapies and the benefit that they come from also comes with a very hefty price tag, and that's going to limit accessibility. So that's one of the other key blockers, I would say, that we're seeing in this space. Now, how can builders help? I think builders can help in a very important way, which is if there is one technology on this planet that can scale better than anything else we know of, it's biology. And so all of the things I'm describing in terms of blockers to access at some point can be addressed by improving our ability to engineer biology to address some of these limitations. So improved biology can make manufacturing much more scalable and therefore much less expensive. Improving the kinds of interventions and the precision by which these programmable medicines work can address some of these questions of permanence or toxicity. So where the builders can really help is just become better programmers of biology. And from that, we will get better applications at higher scale and at lower cost, and hopefully get them in the hands of patients more quickly.
That's amazing. And maybe one super quick question to end things off is, a lot of our listeners are familiar with the idea of exponentially decreasing cost in things like software. Do you see that same kind of curve being applied here when you're talking about decreasing costs? Is that really the future that you're painting, where these things, instead of costing millions of dollars, we're talking thousands? Is that really in the future?
That's the hope. And the possibility is there. Because again, biology can scale exponentially. We all did come from one cell, and here we are. We're sitting here.
That's such a great point.
Yeah. So I think, but there's work to be done there. We haven't seen it yet.
Absolutely.
But that's the promise and that's the hope.
All right. I hope you enjoyed this big idea. We do have a lot more on the way, including a new age of maritime exploration that takes advantage of AI and computer vision, plus AI-first games that never end, and whether voice-first apps may finally be having their moment. By the way, if you want to see our full list of 40 plus big ideas today, you can head on over to a16z.com/bigideas2024. It's time to build.